While President Trump is maintaining his position on China regarding tariffs, here's the president yesterday. Watch.
China says in order to have substantive negotiations, you have to bring down your 145% tariffs. Are you open to pulling back your tariffs in order to get China to the negotiating table?
No.
Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Trade Representative Jamieson Greer will travel to Switzerland today, and that is where they will meet Beijing officials and have trade talks this weekend. The president also highlighting the importance of stopping the flow of deadly fentanyl into the United States as part of that agreement, potential agreement. Watch.
Mr. President, what are you hoping your representatives will get out of the talks in Switzerland on China?
Well, they have to stop fentanyl from coming in. That'll be a very big part. And I had that understanding with President Xi before I left last time, and we had a deal, and he would have honored the deal. But when Biden came in, of course, nothing ever happened with him.
All of this coming as Beijing attempts to boost its own economy, expecting to see an increase of $291 billion worth across-the-board rate cuts as well as stimulus announced in China yesterday. Joining me now is Gatestone Institute Senior Fellow Gordon Chang. Gordon, good to see you. Thanks so much for being here. I guess two questions to kick us off. On the one hand, what is your assessment of what China did this week in terms of all of that stimulus into its economy? It's certainly feeling the pain of President Trump's tariffs. And secondly, what do you want to hear this weekend in these trade talks with Scott Bessent?
With regard to the Chinese economy, it is anomalous that they reported 5.4% growth for the first quarter, and now they're talking about emergency stimulus with their rate cuts and with the reduction in the bank reserve requirement ratio, which is basically Beijing saying that they lied about their economy. It's not going to be enough for what's going on because China needs a fundamental restructuring, and that's not going to happen under Xi Jinping. With regard to the trade talks, it's important for us not to reduce our tariffs until China has fully complied with its obligations. We've had so many trade deals with China, and they have dishonored them all. They even dishonored the January 2020 Phase 1 trade deal, which was very easy for China to comply with. All they had to do was buy targeted amounts of American agriculture and products, and they failed to do that. They only met 58% of their commitments. And they did that during a campaign year. And very well, maybe they did that in order to make sure that President Trump was not reelected. So I hope President Trump remembers what the Chinese did in January 2020, because it's so significant.
There are also all these other non-trade barriers, right? But the president said that he is going to bring up Chinese entrepreneur Jimmy Lai and his case during these talks with China, calling calling this, quote, a very good idea. Of course, Lai has been imprisoned in Hong Kong and held in solitary confinement since December of 2020 on these fake charges of conspiracy to collide with foreign forces and conspiracy to publish seditious material. Gordon, what are your thoughts on this? Of course, Jimmy Lai joined us many times on this program. In fact, I believe he was here for his last interview right before they took him in handcuffs and put him away.
This is a great
I expected I would have to go to jail, but I don't know when and for how long. But definitely, I would not admit guilty, because for somebody who is determined to resist, I would never admit guilty.
So there's Jimmy Lai in literally one of his last interviews, Gordon, with me here on this program. Your thoughts on whether or not President Trump can make a difference here for Jimmy Lai?
President Trump can certainly make a big difference for Jimmy Lai. And this is a great move on the part of our president to raise this really critical issue. So I think that it's important, and Maria, when the Hong Kong people are free and when Jimmy Lai is out of jail, it'll be because of Americans like you did not let this issue drop. This is really important that we continue to talk about Jimmy Lai, and great kudos to the president for not letting this matter lie dead.
Yeah, that's right. And thank you for that, Gordon. Look, the last thing Xi Jinping wants to see are people protesting in the streets, right? And what did we see in China? More protests erupting in China's factory workers. They're demanding back pay. It's in response to President Trump's tariffs taking a toll on the Chinese economy, Gordon. So how significant do you see these protests, and how would you assess how weak the Chinese economy is right now? I mean, exports have plummeted. Manufacturing activity has plummeted, Gordon.
What we saw from the price data for February and March showed that China's in a deflationary spiral. and that is inconsistent with any report of robust growth. The first indication we had from April, which was the Purchasing Managers Index, confirmed the contraction of the factory sector, which means everything in China is going down. So the Chinese economy is contracting. The U.S. accounts for about 21% of China's exports when you take into account rerouted goods. And that means these factories are closing. They'll continue to close. Workers will continue to go on the streets demanding back pay. China can control this now. But if this continues, no coercive machinery of the Communist Party will be able to contain this. We know the Chinese people are volatile. We've seen these extraordinary protests, especially the ones that started in October 2022 when things were good in China, or relatively good. So right now, I'm sure the Communist Party is extremely insecure.
Yeah, well, they certainly have felt the pain. You penned an op-ed for Fox yesterday on how President Trump can reshape the Middle East and keep China from gaining more influence there. Of course, China is trying to dominate everywhere across the world. Tell us more about the Middle East as the president goes to Saudi Arabia on Monday.
Yeah, the new Syrian president, Ahmed al-Shara, not only wants to move Syria into America's orbit, he wants the American system for Syria. He doesn't want American aid. He wants American trade and investment. And that should be music to President Trump's ears, especially because Shara does not want the Chinese taking over his country. And China's pressing really hard. As you point out, President Trump will be in Riyadh on the 13th. The Saudi hosts want President Trump to meet Shara. That meeting has not yet been confirmed. But I think this would be a good thing for the region, and it would be a great thing for the United States. We can remake the Middle East with our trade and investment, what we did in Japan and Germany. And al-Shara actually talks about, he wants to be Japan and Germany. He doesn't want to be Iraq and Afghanistan. In Iraq and Afghanistan, American business did not follow the American military, but it did in Japan and Germany. And Shara wants to be Japan and Germany.
Yeah, great op-ed. Gordon, good to see you this morning. Thank you, sir.